going to go on the DA, and then on case and voters. Right? Everybody ready? Okay, so to respond to the T on the counter interpretation, my first response is that alternative interpretation is not a better interpretation. And my second response is that if you, as a judge, whoever the judge is, deems that both interpretations are fair and debatable, then you're always going to vote for the government interpretation because we are the ones that reserve the right to define. So you're not going to bother looking at the alternative interpretation because we're fair and we're debatable. I'm going to prove this through the following reasons. When they talk about there's three different options of choice about industrial, commercial, and the third one, which I don't really remember, residential, we meet because on the violation because we also include industrial development because, like we mentioned, we're going to build the biodome. If you don't see that as being industrial, that is pretty industrial to me. Like we're building a biodome. Second, we meet because we are increasing access to resources, which is pretty much in the frame of the resolution. So we meet the interpretation of the residential because and commercial because that is increasing access to the resources. So we meet their violation of their topicality. Also, when we drop down to the standards, when they talk about the field contents and how they were supposed to make land development, my first response is that development doesn't mean it has to be land development. There's many different interpretations of development, and we chose to parametricize our interpretation through our plan, which we stated. And one example is that when you develop technology, like for example, Apple develops an iPhone. That is not land, but it's still a development. So we meet their standards of their interpretation of when they're trying to talk about the field context. And when they're talking about they lose grounds, they don't lose any grounds at all because any arguments that they prep, they could have ran. And when they try to make arguments saying that they lose access to hegemony arguments, that's not true because they can still run how our plan is passed by Obama and the administration and United States only. This is a unilateral decision in which that is very hegemony because we're not taking any consideration to any other countries. We're just saying the United States is the best, and therefore we're going to pass this plan. They could have ran a huge DA, in which I probably would vote against that. But since they didn't do it, and since they're just trying to not use this, that's a reason not to go on topicality because they have huge axes against our plan. They just didn't choose to use it. So when they talk about the voters, they said that vote on the resolution. You're not going to vote on the resolution because we provided all the reasons and warrants of why we're being fair and debatable. And they said to severe advantage one, you're not going to severe advantage one just because it's a really good advantage on how that we provide a global protection of the human race and how that is a reason. That's not a reason to vote against. That's not a reason to vote for T. That just means that we have a really gangster plan prepped out by Matt Foltz. Thank you, Matt Foltz. Okay, so now moving on to the DA. When they talk about, I'm not really sure what it was called, but they say that on the uniqueness part, they say that life is unpredictable. And yeah, life is unpredictable. And that's why we need to vote for our plan. Because they just admit that life is unpredictable and we can't control it. That means we don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know what's happening. Extinction is going to happen. What it's possible for the future. So that's a reason to vote for the plan. When they talk about their own uniqueness, about life being unpredictable and we have no control, that's a reason to vote for the plan for alternative methods of protecting ourselves from this unpredictable methods and us not being able to have any control. And they talk about how that on the link that the plan equals no control because it's a blank slate of evolution. And they bring up a lot of arguments how the macros, and when they drop down to the impact saying that it's going to produce a lot of methane. We haven't passed any plans like this before, so there's no empirical evidence saying that this impact would happen. So there's very low probability of this argument, and there's no warrants they could possibly provide saying that our plan directly will provide this impact of increasing methane because we have never passed a plan like this in the past, so they cannot cross-apply any evidence saying that it will happen. So it's very low probability of their impacts, and plus, even if you do believe that this impacts of the macros happening does exist, even though I truly believe it will not happen, I believe that our advantages of saving the human life and increasing resources completely outweigh their whole disadvantages. Also, you could cross-apply their fear-mongering arguments because their whole DA is built on fear-mongering, on the fear-mongering of macros. So when they talk about fear-mongering, they're just buying into the whole DA. So you're just going to not really they're not going to really go on fear-mongering because their whole case is built on fear-mongering. So when we look on case, when they mentioned most of the responses were built on fear mongering and low probability of extinction. My first response today, just because there's a low probability of extinction doesn't mean you shouldn't vote for a plan. That's the reason to vote for the plan, because they meant that there is a possibility. And if there is a possibility, that means you want to vote for the plan because we are preparing for possibilities of future extinction for the humankind. And we want to protect that. And that was our thesis, and we're going to continue with that thesis. Also, when they say that we don't have the capabilities of building the biodome, and that's not a reason to vote against the plan. That's a reason to vote for the plan, because our plan is increasing our capabilities of building the biodome. And if you don't vote for the plan, that cuts out all access to future development on the moon. When you vote for a plan, that increases all future access of development on the moon. So that's a reason to vote for the plan, because it increases us being able to build a biodome and increase resources and future possibilities that we didn't mention, but that's a future possibilities that happens through the plan. And so that's the reason to vote for the plan. So some voters today to go over today. Reasons why you're going to vote for our plan is because, one, what would Jesus do? Jesus would go for saving the humankind. And that's what our plan proposes. Providing a method to save the humankind. And so that's the reason you're going to vote for our plan. So cross-apply all our impacts of saving the humankind, because we strongly defended it and we strongly affirm it. And then when we talk about increasing resources, they completely drop that. So don't let them come up in the rebuttals and make any arguments about increasing resources, because they completely did not make any responses to that. And another reason to vote for the plan is because all their arguments against on case are just defense, small defense at best. They didn't make any really turns or any offense arguments on our on case. And so another reason to vote for the plan is because of fear mongering fights their own DA. And we properly disapprove the fear mongering. And even if you do believe that, we strongly believe that what would Jesus do and increasing resources completely outweigh fear mongering or the macros happening. And another reason to vote for the plan is because our plan is a step to increase future possibilities of development. Thank you. Oh yeah, I didn't mention the Palladium.
Yeah, I thought it'd be cool in an earlier speech. I'll take that.
I want to hear Joe kick some ass.
As do I.
I'll see.
I don't like going against Joe. I like to be with Joe. It's not fun.
I'm sure that's how Christian feels.
Well, something fun about it. Different.
It's fun.
Yeah.
We know who wins.
How long do I have? 7?
Something like that.
That's what me and Matt normally in.
When the broadcast went on radio waves in the late 1960s about War of the Worlds and aliens are invading, people freaked out and started seriously forming militias to protect themselves from these aliens that were invading. But what we quickly realized was that all that fear-mongering just did nothing but get people into a frenzy, because that was just simply a story by a science fiction author. So we think it's important, especially in the context of extraterrestrial debates, the moon obviously is an extraterrestrial entity, that we're concerned with fear-mongering and how this can play in. So I'm basically just going to talk about their voters and then get to our voters. Actually, I'm going to, I guess, go in the same order that they went in. So first, I'm going to get to the T debate. So on the T debate, their responses are, just because it's an alternative interpretation doesn't mean it's better, and that as long as it's a fair debate and there's ground on both sides, then you're not going to be voting for T. But my response is that it's not a fair debate when we talk about our ground being taken and we can't run hedge arguments, and at the same time, basically their plan text talks about them terraforming, which is more residential development, but then they try to get advantages of resources. So that's where we're saying that the abuse is. That if they're going to do terraforming, that's residential and you can save humankind, but then don't also try to talk about mining that's going to be happening, because that's what we think is abusive and gaining too much extra solvency. So when you say that you meet on the violation because you include industrial, that's just the point of the topicality, is that like because your plan is residential terraforming to, like for people to live on, and you're still trying to get industry solvency points, that's where like that's not you meet the violation, that's you are the violation. Like your interpretation is a violation of the resolution. So then, like on the standards debate, talking about context, field context, where like you should be focusing on one of the three types of development. They say they're doing one, but then they say that they're also sort of doing industry to get resources. So that's where we say that our ground is taken, and also on the ground standard, which is the most important, they say that there was none lost, that we didn't lose hedge access to that argument, but we did lose access to that argument. In the first cross X, Jared says he would have ran that argument, but we didn't have access to it. And then next is about like industrial development on the moon. We lose that ground because they're taking that and they're taking residential. So then, like back down to the voters, there is fairness that's a voter here, and there is ground that's taken. And also, they had the option to just sever their AD1, and we could have a good debate about like terraforming for humans to live on, or and how that would be the advantage and how that would be topical. But they don't sever that advantage. They just say because it's a good advantage, that's why they're not severing it. And I think that our point is like that's the abuse right there, like that specific advantage. So like they have to sever one of them, either the residential or the industrial. But they don't do that, and so that's why we say our ground is taken. So now let's get to their disadvantage, or like their case arguments to our unintended consequences disadvantage. They talk about, because they agree with our uniqueness and say because life is unpredictable, we need this plan. But I think they were getting a little bit confused with what Jared meant when he talked about life being unpredictable. He instantly then starts talking about biological life and microbes. He's not saying life in general, like rhetorically, is unpredictable. He's talking about biological life and how that interacts as unpredictable, especially when it's introduced into new environments. That's not a reason why we need to prefer plan. That's a reason why plan is going to be harmful, because we're going to allow all these microbes to be introduced into a new foreign blank slate environment. Next, they say that there's no warrant that we increase methane production. Essentially, any industrial project that happens, so if you're going to say that it's industrial, any industrial project that happens, releases methane. It's very likely that whatever your plan is going, like the terraforming, is going to increase methane. Unless you're somehow going to do this without using like any fossil fuels or anything like that. So then finally they say, so it's just a low probability of happening. And that just because it's a low probability of happening doesn't mean like not to vote for plan. But basically, we've seen this happen where when biological life is introduced into a foreign territory and is allowed to spread, it has massive undesired consequences. So like, for example, when the Spaniards found the new land, and they essentially, all of their microbes were able to spread into the indigenous population and get them really, really sick. We're saying that could happen on the moon, not to indigenous populations, but rather just to the atmosphere in general and to any sort of other microbial life forms that are living there. So there are unintended consequences, and we do think it's serious. So now on their voters, they say, what would Jesus do? My response is, we don't know what Jesus would do. He didn't live in an era of space travel. But if we were to look at what his father says, to think about like how he's getting his morals, that his father would probably not be for the saving of the entire human race. And we saw that with the Great Flood. So probably, I think if we look at just what Jesus' father is teaching him, Jesus is not going to want this to happen. Next, they say that they increase resources. And we say that's why you're being abusive, and then they say our case arguments are defensive, and our case arguments are basically saying that what you're doing is abusive, so we're not going to basically interact with it, and at the same time, it's just pure fear-mongering. So now let me get to our voters. First is our abuse of the T. So you're going to be voting on T because of the abuse there. Next is our disadvantage of unintended consequences. And finally is how their background is just very unlikely. They have no probability warrants, and how we gave arguments on how we can avoid these scenarios, and there's no response to that. So they're just trying to create fear, and so that's why you're going to be voting for opposition today, because their plan will fail, and it's not realistic, and the only time we've tried to do a biodome in history before, it failed miserably.
That was really fun. I think I had more fun watching